Hi, thank you for joining us today. Before we start today, I would like to acknowledge that we are in the traditional homelands of the Umpqua and Coos people. There is an old Indian prophecy that claims one day the cost of 1 ounce of water will equal the cost of 1 ounce of gold. Unfortunately, due to our human-caused water crisis, this is becoming a reality. So I'm John Hunter. I'm president of the Community Rights Douglas County and also the treasurer of Oregon Community Rights Network. Together we are hosting today's event. Community rights confronts the harm caused by corporations and places the rights of all residents of this planet above the rights of corporations. Many of us in Douglas County are all too familiar with water shortages and the harm to our watersheds resulting from corporate harmful practices. Using the theme Water is Us, we are trying to create awareness of the need for water protection and the way we view water. So today it is with great pleasure for me to introduce Christopher Hall, Executive Director of Water League, and his presentation, Beneficial Use of Water for Posterity. Water League engages the public in water stewardship, equitable access to water, and its conservation for future generations. Now, Chris, go ahead.
All right, well, thank you, John, and thank you for coming out. Resolving our conflict with our future selves. So you've heard the old saying that whiskey's for drinking and water's for fighting. Well, actually, it's about not just fighting in the present, it's the future that we're talking about, being in conflict with our future selves. And the beneficial use of water for posterity means using water today to benefit future generations. Posterity just means future generations. And if we can find ways to use water that serves the future, we surely will be taking care of ourselves here in the present as well. And we refer to that as the literal use of water to secure our future. I just want to remind everybody today that all opinions expressed here are Water League and Water League's only. So, Water League, we are a nonprofit organization, 501c3, and we engage the public in water stewardship. There are 4.2 million Oregonians, and just a couple thousand people manage and govern and control all the water in the state. And that's fine if after 150 years, the system was working. However, the system is not working as planned, or if it were working as planned, then we actually have a bigger problem than we think we do. So we encourage the public to get engaged and be the water that they want to be. This beautiful picture, we're going to start out with something nice because we're going to move into a discussion that's going to be very challenging. This beautiful creek is called Little Grayback Creek. It's in the Illinois Valley, which is in Josephine County, Southwest Oregon. And this is a September photograph with base flows coming from groundwater seeping into the surface water channels. And that water is cool, it's crisp, and it's clean. And what I would like to say is the Illinois Valley has some of the cleanest, purest, most beautiful waters in the state of Oregon, if not the Pacific Northwest. And we are really lucky to have such a beautiful, beautiful region, so well protected and cared for. Water League engages the public in water stewardships on various topics. One is water use and water quality. Another is equitable access to water. Conservation of water for posterity, for future generations. Beneficial use preferences and priorities. So what does that mean? That means preferring and prioritizing the highest and best uses, especially since we're starting to run out. Public interest as it applies to water use. So there are individual interests, like just I'm going to use all the water I want. And there's the public interest that says, well, maybe we should think a little bit more outside your own personal needs. There is the connection between the environmental health and the public health. As you all know, we have these lovely built environments and we build them within the natural environment. And everything we have in our homes, in our towns, in our cities, in our farms, everything comes from the natural environment. And if we don't take care of where all that comes from, then not only today, but future generations will suffer. And the public trust doctrine, which goes back, well, so among the West, Europeans, it goes back 2,000 years. With indigenous people, it goes back since time immemorial. What that means is that our leaders and everyone, including ourselves, hold water in trust. And we hold water in trust so that we can ensure that water will be there fresh, clean, and pure, not just today, again, for the future. And then rights and responsibilities to nature. We oftentimes hear rights of nature, and a good friend of mine, Dan, who told me once, Chris, how can you give a right to nature? And it was a really good question. It's like, no, you have more of a responsibility. And so that really rang true. And so we really embrace reciprocity in that respect. Water League acknowledges and honors all the indigenous peoples who made their homes since time immemorial throughout the areas where Water League works and upon whose ancestral homelands we live. Water League acknowledges the care by which indigenous inhabitants have stewarded precious natural resources for millennia and seeks to be of service within this historical framework. It is a real honor to do so. Water League, we hold biospheric values, the value of recognizing that each of us is the closest to nature we will ever get. It is that our bodies are the closest to water that we'll ever be. And biospheric values is caring for how we act as a valued element and emanation of nature. It is being connected with nature and not referring it to this thing out there called the wild. We believe how we treat water is how we treat ourselves, and it's how we treat each other. We invite all to get in league with water, which is getting in league with each other, building community through water. And that is a lovely way to make connections with all of our relatives that we have learned, the flora, the fauna, the humans, the mountains, rivers, glades, meadows, and aquifers, all together as a community. And all of these communities live in watersheds or basins. So now we're going to get started with our presentation, and we're going to take a look at how settlers and their successors use, extract, and exploit water. I will tell you that these three verbs, use, extract, and exploit, they're like the words we settlers use. And I just want to remind us that if we are water, and if water is part of our family, then maybe we should consider what does it mean to use water? Because we don't use our friends, that's kind of sociopathic, and we don't exploit or extract from people. And so when we do that to water, we're really doing that to ourselves. So this is a slide from the business case for investing in water. This is a large, well-documented report that came out a year ago that the Water Resource Commission requested. And what you'll see is on the left of this slide is where the water comes from, and on the right is where it goes out. Where it comes from is two different places, surface water and groundwater. Surface water, about 78% of all the diversions that come from the earth, from the ecosystem, are surface, and about 22% come from aquifers and groundwater reservoirs. And then on the right, how does it get used? Well, what's interesting is that 78% of the use is for irrigation. And we're not talking like just your front yard or your little half-acre garden. We're talking large scale, massive industrial irrigation. And you'll see at the top, near the top, domestic self-supply. That's almost a quarter million. It's 225,000 domestic wells. They use less than 1% of all the water every year. And then there's the public supply, which is at 9%. And that's every city and public municipal supply. That includes Facebook farms, server farms. That includes industrial, commercial uses, all the water that we use in cities and in communities that have public water supplies. So when you think of 4.2 million people, really, all the domestic wells and all of the folks who live in suburbs and cities are on a daily basis themselves directly using only 10% of the water supply. And that last 10% there with aquaculture and hatchery, a lot of that is passed through. You know, it's coming through the creek, goes into their pools, and then goes back out again. I'll point one more thing out. 1.5% of Oregon's GDP, which is the gross domestic product of the state, irrigated agriculture contributes 1.5%, which is a very small amount. This is another chart, and it only looks at that 22% of groundwater that we use every year. And so on the left, you'll see a blue line, and you'll see some red lines too. The blue line is the number of wells, just the absolute number of wells. And so under that first column, it says domestic. So if we look at like 225,000 domestic wells, well, they account for 88% of all the wells. Now that red line, or that red vertical line, that's actually the use. Well, it turns out that 88% of the wells use 4% of the groundwater. Now we go to the next one, irrigation, and you'll see that blue line is really low. That is 7% of all the wells happen to use 82% of all the groundwater. And so we can see here that even among wells that are drilled into the groundwater reservoirs and aquifers, that nearly 250,000 domestic wells barely even show up on the radar screen. So when we talk about fixing that shower head, we're not really talking about saving or conserving a lot of water compared to these massive, massive irrigation industrial projects that extract water from surface water streams and, well, in this case, groundwater. And for some perspective, similar to other states in the West, and again, most of these numbers are very similar for California, for Arizona, for Nevada, and other places in the world where there's large-scale irrigation, is that 5% of Oregon's farms equal or account for 80% of the $5 billion industry. Now, let's not get me wrong, $5 billion is pretty small compared to California. That might just be like Kern County, for instance. 10% of all the farms in Oregon account for 87% of the acreage. So you've heard about farm consolidation. That's what we're talking about. As a kid in Vermont, I grew up on an apple orchard in Middletown Springs, Vermont, and it was altogether about 150, 200 acres. And I remember there being a little cartoon from the New Yorker on our refrigerator, and it showed a little fairy coming and tapping a tractor, a farmer driving a tractor and saying, every 20 minutes, a small farm goes out of business. That was like in the early 80s. And so consolidation has been going on apace for a long time. And just lastly, 95% of all the farms that we see when we drive around and we think that they look pretty, those are the smaller farms. Those are the ones where, you know, they are much, much smaller than the 5%. Here's some stats as to how consolidation has occurred. In 1790, farmers comprised 90% of the population. And in 1850, that number dropped to 64%. By 1900, it dropped to 38%. By 1940, it dropped to 18%. By 1990, it dropped to 2.6%. And today, it is 1% of the population. So now we live in what I consider a post-agrarian society, with 99% of the population conducting other business, departing far from the Thomas Jeffersonian notion of a beautiful agrarian society. Farm consolidation has mainly resulted in what we call agribusiness. Indeed, given the industrial structure of agriculture, which has resulted from this intense consolidation, Jefferson wouldn't recognize the vast majority of food production as farming activity. Rather, he would refer to it as manufacturing. So when modern humans occupy a territory, we fabricate and create these built environments by degrading natural resources commonly understood as the natural environment. We mentioned this earlier. And a lot of these big industrial farms are these big built environments that are imposing onto the natural environment in a number of ways. One of the most concerning is the extraction of surface water and groundwater at vast scales compared to every other water use. Every aspect of this activity includes water use and what I refer to as water abuse. And Oregon's history includes examples such as the extirpation of indigenous people, clear cutting of forests, nearly exterminating the entire beaver population, impairing waterfowl habitats by draining lakes and marshes, paving, poisoning, and denuding soils, destroying the habitat for anadromous fish and surface water food chains, overgrazing regions with cattle, industrializing rivers, and mining water, building sprawling cities and industrial sites, including CAFOs and massive irrigation forage crop operations. And lastly, kindling wildfires through the gross mismanagement of forests by overstocking monocrops solely engineered for profitable timber production. All of these activities depend on the use, extraction, and exploitation of water. Every single one of them has water in common. Settler conventional wisdom. And if you wonder what is conventional wisdom, I refer to it as the set of ideas all the way off to the side here when we run out of common sense and we reach the limits of common sense, we start going into what I refer to as the conventional wisdom. And the conventional wisdom says water equals money. And for one example, the research that we have done, alfalfa east of the Cascades in the Oregon desert unlocks about 1/11 of 1 cent per gallon. That has to do with the price per ton of alfalfa. It has to do with how many tons of alfalfa you're getting per acre. It has to do with how much water you're using. And so every farm could be a little bit different. Maybe you test this farm, it's 1/10 of 1 cent, but the average is coming out at that number, which means that if you have an idea of how much water is underneath your feet, you have an idea of how much money you can unlock. And we can estimate the financial value that is in aquifers and streams. Now, you have to know, this is the law, ORS, Oregon Revised Statutes 536.310, titled Purposes and Policies to be Considered in Formulating a State Water Resources Program. It says, it is in the public interest that integration and coordination of uses of water and augmentation of existing supplies for all beneficial purposes be achieved for the maximum economic development thereof for the benefit of the state as a whole. That means water use must be for economic purposes. Yet we know that there are so many other actual real purposes for water. So if water equals money, then is it just like gold? Is it like oil? Because we value water as an economic resource to extract and mine for financial value, it appears as if we will stop at nothing to extract water. This is a friend of mine, and that is the river right beside his house that, well, he has water rights for. He's been there for 50 years. They turned the river into a gravel road. This is a northeastern portion of the Harney Basin, which is in the Malheur Lake Basin in eastern Oregon. And there's a lot of alkali out there and a lot of irrigation that has concentrated the alkalis even more. Note, however, one of the uses of water, beneficial uses, is to actually use so much water that you can wash that alkali away, and it's just not possible. And this is what we're doing to the planet. So how much money is left after we extract all the value that we can from the land? And you can remember, think of gold, right? We constantly seek to take the ecology and turn it into the economy, hammer and tong. In every aspect of our society, we're taking the ecology, turning it into the economy, hammer and tong, and we're using it up for its waste value and for everything else we can. And it's a constant ongoing process, and water is at the center of it. What happens when we mine the land of its water and determine that there is nothing left that's worth extracting? And I'm going to hit this little asterisk here. The asterisk is that we call that reaching the economic pumping level, regarding the point when an irrigator determines it's not worth pumping the groundwater anymore, just as a gold miner determines the last few grains of gold aren't worth all that digging. So what's going to happen when we mine the land of its water and determine that there is nothing left worth extracting? We can measure the rate of flow in aquifers. So if we were thinking to ourselves about that 1/11 of 1 cent and all that value that we can unlock by mining that water, well, we can measure the size of the aquifers. We can measure how fast the water moves through it. That's called transmissivity. We can measure how much that aquifer groundwater reservoir can store. That's called the storage coefficient. And if you think of a glass and you fill it with ice cubes or marbles rather, the size of the marbles affects the storage coefficient. And with that information, we can measure a number of other items. We add in the discharge and the recharge coming in every year, and we can estimate how many years are left in that groundwater reservoir, which equals how much money is left to mine. So if we know that alfalfa unlocks 1/11 of 1 cent, and we know how much water is down there based on, these knowable factors, we can figure out what's left. And we can determine the same for streams. We can see how much value is in the stream before we dewater that stream every summer. We argue that we must be more careful about how we separate water from land because the two substances form one entity. All water policy, all water use policy is about managing the process of separating water from land. And we hold that our policies are flawed. And when we say our policies are flawed, not every single policy, but too many of our policies are flawed. When we extract water from land, we drain its life force. If you extract the water from me, I just become a piece of beef jerky. We know that water animates life. It does so for land. We know that there are groundwater dependent ecosystems. There are trees. Some scientists say that the amount of life that is subterranean is far greater than what's above the earth, the terrestrial, aquatic, and birds and so forth. All water animates life. Our policies ignore this obvious fact, or worse, extract the value of life in a short-sighted, short-term effort for temporary gain. Again, it's just like the gold rush, but we're living in a society that is the water rush. And we actually are living in a society that is a rush of so many other things. And that we must be more mindful of, we argue. If water is life, and we believe water is life, then it appears that we may be extracting ourselves. Worse, we are foreclosing on the future and extracting the lives of those yet to come. We believe that we are in a conflict with our future selves. The public of the future is at risk. The environmental health of the ecosystem we all rely upon for survival is at risk. Harming the ecosystem is like eating the seed corn. In less than 200 years, we have severely harmed our water sources, and the problem is worsening. And we should know that, since time immemorial, tens of thousands of years, there was a balance between the water discharge, the water recharge, and the way that the indigenous peoples lived here and lived with water. And in just 200 years, as we came across the West, we sacked the place, turned it into the Wild West, And now we are in for a real accounting. In the 19th century, few water users thought that they might be doing harm to the future. How would they have known? Because there were so few of them and they really weren't thinking about that. Now we have 4.2 million Oregonians, and it's been in just such a short time that we exploded this population. So why hasn't the water code and the water laws been sufficient to address this problem? Why can't officials legislate the harm away? You might ask that question. Well, the answer is because they have always focused on legislating economic benefits for the short-term present and turned too much of a blind eye to the harms threatening the future. Again, this isn't like 100%. There have been so many people before us, especially during the 1955 legislative session when they overhauled and modernized the water code back then. There were some very important voices who were saying the exact same thing I am saying today. I am not saying anything new. I am simply carrying a message that has been carried before, and I hope to do service. Today, we know better. We actually knew better back then, but we still don't make the right choices. We know that we are fighting the future with its hands tied behind its back. Our descendants are the quintessential silent majority with no voice. They cannot join us here and stand up for themselves. Will our great-grandchildren scratch their heads and wonder what on earth were we thinking? There is a very good chance that they will. So here's an example. Oregon exports 80% of all agricultural crops, right? We grow $5 billion worth of stuff, and 80% of the crops get exported. 40% just cross state lines, and then another 40% leave the nation and go abroad. This is conventionally viewed, remember the conventional wisdom, this is conventionally viewed as a great success. But our water goes with those exports in the form of virtual water exports. So when tens of thousands of acres of alfalfa are grown, Eastern Cascades in the desert, and they're mining the groundwater, in some cases, in some places, 100,000 acre foot deficit every year between recharge and discharge, and the water levels are dropping and they're dropping and they're dropping. Every bale of hay that goes to Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, to Japan or China or elsewhere is taking with it that water. And we're going to explain why. The volume on Earth of water, the volume of water on Earth is constant. We know that that's true. However, its location and its quality changes. The quality can become salty if it ends up staying in the ocean, or if it's degraded by various chemicals or concentrated by soil salinization. And you know, the location and quality change, well, that'll be fine, so long as you have fresh water that you need to live. So if the water's coming and then it's going and it's leaving and it's not sticking around, but you still have water, well, I suppose that's fine, right? Water scarcity, however, is the result of scaring off water, like a deer. There is still deer around in this world, but they're not in your backyard anymore. And we're going to touch on what water scarcity is in a bit. And here's a great irony. Never in human history have so many people pumped so much water away from themselves in an ironic effort to pump water towards themselves. The more pumps we put in these deep wells, pumping hundreds and thousands of gallons a day out of each well, and drying and dewatering streams, the more and more we apply the power of the pump to these water sources to use and extract and exploit that water in the short term, the more it's leaving us. And it's a terrible irony. Annual groundwater recharge has been declining, and it's been declining for a number of decades in different basins at different rates. We are recently seeing greater declines as a result of climate change, prolonged drought, and even what they call a 1 in 1,200 year mega drought. And we're seeing a stair-stepping down of groundwater levels And in some areas, it's happening faster than others. We have perennial streams that are now drying up during the summers. And with regard to the changing climate, because we also pump too much oil and too much gas, we see a stair stepping down. I'm going to explain here where during the summers, it usually goes down, but then it comes back up in the winters. Well, now it's going down in the summers and it's only coming back up a little bit. Now it's going down further and it's only coming back a little bit. And that stair stepping is real and it's happening across the West. It's happening in the Pacific Northwest. It's happening in Oregon, and it's happening in your watershed and in your community. Again, at different rates. Aquifers, which have been fully stocked throughout the ages, and tree roots are now finding that they can't reach where they used to think the water was. I will point out that tree roots do not reach as deep as our domestic wells that go 40 to 200 feet, and they certainly don't reach the 500 to 1,000 feet that irrigation wells can go to. In fact, the only way to evaporate deep groundwater is with a pump. And so the idea that the trees are harming the groundwater levels is just absurd. Is the unprecedented damage to our water sources and the creatures in the present and the future, is that worth irrigated agriculture's 1.5% contribution to Oregon's GDP? Remember, the law says that all water has to be used for an economic purpose. And here, 78% of all the water that's diverted in the state of Oregon contributes 1.5% of the GDP. We think the trade-off for the damage isn't worth it. We say no. Not even by double or triple counting other economic factors and activity within the economy that are 2 to 3 degrees separation from irrigated agriculture can justify the level of harm that's occurring in the present and the future. It's just not worth it. As mentioned, we are in a 1 in 1,200 year mega drought, and we experience over appropriation of water in every basin. That's too many big scale water rights. And it's leading to increasing aridification in the West. And it's causing declining aquifers and streams. I'm just going to remind us that 250,000 number of domestic wells accounts for just 4% of all the groundwater used every year. So when we talk about over appropriation, we are not talking about our little home domestic wells. Natural variability and water scarcity. What's the difference? Natural variability is like, oh, here comes an asteroid or a big meteorite that causes the dinosaurs to go away. Oh, it's the ice age. Oh, it's like the cyclical patterns that have been happening since time immemorial. And in fact, actually, it's the seasons. It's fall, winter, summer, spring. It's every scale of change that happens naturally. And for the most part, we don't really control things. We do not control hurricanes, right? However, we have caused anthropogenic climate change. And so our built environments that we have constructed, which includes pumping a lot of fossil fuels, has had an impact on the natural variability. That much is true. Water scarcity, that is a result of the policies. You can think of water scarcity in the same way as like economic scarcity or inequality. How do we get such incredible inequality in nearly every developed nation across the earth? Economic inequality. Well, we prioritize, some people get the money, some people don't. We have all sorts of like theories and policies and systems to defend that. And with regard to water, it's no different. Water scarcity is where some people get the water and other people don't. And some people get the water and other creatures and flora and fauna don't. It is a political decision, and it is within and parentheses within the natural variability. Water scarcity is a human-caused problem. So we're going to focus on what we can control. And what we can control is over-pumping of water. I want to put a little side note here. The largest water users now argue it's not their pumping that's dewatering streams every summer and draining aquifers for generations. They're saying it's climate change because they know climate change is out of our control for the most part, and it deflects responsibility away from them. So this idea that climate change is draining the rivers and pumping the aquifers is just not true. The amount of evaporation from the river will never come close, possibly within 1 or 2 orders of magnitude as to what electric pumps are doing. And of course, climate change doesn't put pumps underground 500 feet. It's just not happening. What's happening is that climate change is having hotter and drier winters in many cases, and so the recharge isn't happening. We have also managed to denude much of the forests and the watersheds, and what happens now is when it does flood and when it does do torrential rains in the wintertime, they're hotter, so it's not ending up as snowpack, and it's also racing out to the ocean. And so that doesn't give time for recharge, or it doesn't give time for the water to seep back into the ground. But to blame climate change for overpumping the aquifers and the rivers is a shame. Overpumping water is not in the greater public interest in the present or the future. It harms our public health and our ecosystems. Overpumping water is the use of water that benefits the user but harms the rest of us. And you'll see an asterisk there. That asterisk is like, well, you know, people are going to be coming running from the Oregon Water Resource Department, shaking their stick and saying, well, but hold on a second. Strictly speaking, it's when groundwater levels are destabilized. That's what overpumping is. Or when in-stream water rights are regulated off in favor of irrigators that end up dewatering the streams. And an in-stream water right, it's a bit of a hoax. Essentially, the state created water rights, and they're giving water rights to nature as if nature isn't the source of all water. To give nature a water right is obscene. In any case, there are all these very junior water rights that are called in-stream water rights, and they're supposed to protect the streams, but of course, because they're junior during the summers and the fall, they get regulated off in favor of senior water users. And so the junior water rights and the whole regime of in-stream water rights almost plays no factor into that. And when irrigators with senior irrigation water rights call for shutoff of in-stream water rights, they end up dewatering the streams often. In his book on liberty, John Stuart Mill said, and this is 1859, and a very famous book, and he's one of the most important political theorists in the West. He said that the only purpose for which power can be rightfully exercised over any other member of a civilized community against his will is to prevent harm to others. When water use harms others, that use is not in the public interest and it cannot be allowed to persist. In the 19th century, water only had to be beneficial to the user. However, in the 20th century, water use had to be in the greater public interest, or at least it could not harm the public health, safety, and welfare. Now, in the 21st century, we argue water use must be in the interest of the public. It must be interest of the public of the future, for posterity and for future generations. And that is a continuation and a transformation away from the ideologies that started the Wild West 150 some odd years ago. That the water use today not only is in the public interest of the present, but also the future. Because if we don't look out for the future, then who is? Because they're not here yet to take care of and stand up for themselves. We must only use water when it is beneficial to the greater public of the present and the future. All water belongs to the public, and that's by law. At the very least, as I've mentioned, water use cannot harm the public. It cannot harm the public health and the ecosystem in the future. It must at least do no harm, the water use. And we call this the beneficial use of water for posterity. It is the literal use of water in the present with an eye to the future. How was water use harm institutionalized into our society, into our system of laws? How is it done? Well, it started with the doctrine of discovery and manifest destiny and the extirpation of indigenous people and all else that stood in the way of conquest for the settlers who were told, go west and take what you find. And in fact, hence the term came the Wild West. The 19th century doctrine of prior appropriation came from the settler miners who extirpated the indigenous peoples and took their lands and their waters and their minerals for themselves, and they did it all under the doctrine of discovery, a formal doctrine of the United States. And the doctrine of discovery is no more complicated than you're walking down the sidewalk and you see a $20 bill on the ground and you pick it up, and for some reason, you now think it's yours because you found it. That is the extent. It is a juvenile and very reductive theoretical concept. And that is what we built the entire expansion of the West on, is if you see it, you can take it. Prior appropriation is also called seniority, which draws inspiration from the heinous reign of monarchy lineages and the firstborn winner takes all. The idea is that if someone got to the river or to the spigot first, then they got to use the water to their heart's content, or nowadays within the limits of their water right. And anybody who comes after them, well, they can use water too, so long as the first person isn't actually experiencing low water levels or they're not getting harmed, right? And so we have built our entire water system on this premise that whoever got in line first, just like a bunch of second graders fighting for who's going to get to go to recess, that whoever gets in line first is the one. And we argue that is a terrible, terrible way to decide the water use in Oregon and throughout the West in the 21st century, because we simply don't have enough, and we have to have more adult, professional, thoughtful, and considerate ways of using water. It's not just whoever got in line first. Its lack of equity is extraordinary, especially when you consider 98.5% of the public don't hold water rights. And they'll never get to hold water rights beyond just the 1.5%, because so many water rights have been given out that they have now shut down giving new groundwater water rights. And 70 years ago, they pretty much shut down giving out surface water rights. So you can't even get new water rights anymore because the overappropriation of water has been so vast. And so there is a mathematical fact that there will always be about 98.5% of the population who has no access to the privilege and the right to own a water right. And what that means is that they will not be experiencing an equal protection under the laws of every state in the West, that they can actually know that the water that belongs to them by law is being used in their interest. Seniority pertains, as I mentioned, to the 1.5% Oregonians who hold water rights on streams and aquifers during the summer and the fall months when they compete for who is going to dewater the stream or drain the aquifer. So think of like 2 or 3 irrigators. They're up on a hill over here, and there's a stream. There's not enough water in July all the way through October. And so the senior water right holder is going to make a call and say, shut off the juniors. And they're arguing among themselves who gets to use that water and who has the privilege of dewatering that stream probably by September. And a stream, mind you, that would have always probably just run as a perennial stream. And that's what prior appropriation seniority does, is it sorts out those bar fights over there. And it's always between just a couple people who are using the water that belongs to the public. Seniority has nothing to do with whether the water use actually benefits society and the ecosystem, or again, at least it doesn't do harm. Seniority has nothing to do with anything but that who got into line first. And you're going to see that little asterisk down there where seniority pertains to 1.5. Theoretically, seniority pertains to anybody who turns on a tap and uses water. But because, again, 78% of all the water use is by large-scale irrigation, industrial irrigation, it doesn't have any meaningful or real-world impacts to the 98.5% of the public. And I put that asterisk in there because again, people would jump up and down mad that, 1/10 of 100th of 1% exception to the rule, counts, which it really doesn't. But there is a doctrine, not the prior appropriation doctrine, but there is a doctrine that does oversee the value of water use as it relates to society and the environment. The compact between the water users up on that hill who are arguing among themselves in July and the rest of the public is a vastly larger in scope. It's not just between the two or three up on the hill, it's between them and all of us. And it's called the beneficial use of water doctrine. And it is throughout the water code. It is repeated in scores and scores of statutes throughout chapters 537, 540, maybe even a little bit in chapter 536. It is a central core tenet of Oregon's water law. All water use must be beneficial, not just to the user, but to society, and at least it can't be detrimental. Since large water users, those folks up on the hill there, have dominated our elected and appointed officials for decades, and we all know, as much as they will use that same political pressure to say it doesn't happen, it does, they have erroneously pressed for the idea that if a water right has the seniority to remain pumping, then virtually nothing can stop the water extraction. Let me repeat that they have pressed for a long time that if a water right has seniority, you can't shut it off for nothing. And again, there are very, very few examples. One of the most important are critical groundwater area designations, of which there is one right now in the Harney County that's underway, where they may end up having to curtail water rights because, frankly, they're pumping themselves out of business. So the state's going to come in and stop them before they pump themselves out of business. The water right users and their elected and appointed officials have strategically ignored the beneficial use of water doctrine and the question of whether their water use is in the public interest of the present and the future. They have stridently ignored this. Remember, our elected officials can pass all the laws they want, and they can choose whether or not to implement them. There is no law that says you have to implement them. How many times, have our friends within the police force, seen somebody roll through a stop sign and not pulled them over? How many times have they elected to implement or enforce the laws on every level in our society? There is nothing that is forcing our elected and appointed officials to enforce the beneficial use of water except you, the people. The state chose to only apply the beneficial use of water doctrine once in the life of a water right, and that is at the time when the water user first proves their use. So they make an application, they get a permit, they take a couple years to show that they can use their water right, and then officials come out, certified water right examiners and so forth, and they check to make sure that the water use is happening. And then if they say it's using it and you're using it the way you thought, then great, the water right's perfected, and they never look back ever again. If a water right was perfected in 1910, then over a century has gone by since anyone has ever gone back to check on whether the water right is still authorizing a beneficial use of water. Think about this. You had to prove that you were using it once when you got the water right, but for every year since then, for over a century, you don't have to say anything. You could be drowning kittens, or for that matter, dewatering creeks and killing all the salmon, right? And all the fry. And no one's going to stop you, right? And in fact, in the state of Oregon, it's not against the law to dewater a stream, especially if your water right is senior to the in-stream water rights that may or may not even be present. I'll also point out this asterisk. There are ways that the state does enforce the beneficial use of water on water rights over the course of the life of that water right. And it's through complaints, almost exclusively through complaints of non-use. So like your neighbor or somebody down the street says, oh, Billy has a water right and Billy hasn't used his water right in 5 years. And so we're complaining and we want you to cancel that water right. He has not put that water right and the water that water that water right authorizes to use. He has not put it to beneficial use. And so ironically, state comes in and it can begin cancellation proceedings, which is just ridiculous, because if somebody's not using their water right, you're going to punish them by taking it away. And that is really almost the only way the state gets in there and threatens a water right based on beneficial use. And it's actually backwards. It's you're not putting it to beneficial use. You're not actually even using it. And that's pretty much the only way it ever happens in the state of Oregon and across the West. We have officials. Why have officials ignored ongoing implementation of the beneficial use of water doctrine? So for instance, all this water is being used to grow hay and alfalfa products that is draining aquifers and streams, and all of that's getting shipped overseas, and it's barely showing up on the radar screen of the GDP. It's just not even barely showing up at all in terms of an economic impact. Why have they ignored this? Well, the reason is because too much irrigation water use would be shown to cause harm, and the political status quo is entrenched beyond all reasonable standards. However, there is one very obvious example that the state could not ignore, and they actually did have to use this concept of a beneficial use of water doctrine, and here it is. This cartoon, oh no, it's Oregon's illegal marijuana cartel. And there are these two people who are being held up and mugged. What do you want? Our wallet, our purse, our keys? Your water. And that's what they want. And these are Oregon's illegal marijuana cartels. Well, actually, they're not cartels, they're organized crime syndicates, because a cartel actually is a set of businesses that come together to organize and manage a market. We know that the cannabis market is in utter shambles. There's no organization. These are just organized crime syndicates. And in Southern Oregon, a lot of them are from Eastern Europe and a bunch of bros from Humboldt County. This was a huge problem in Southern Oregon in 2021. We researched how organized crime syndicates sacked the Southwest in 2021 and increased the irrigated acreage by 450% in Josephine County, which led to horrendous negative impacts. Their water use may have been beneficial to the users, but it wasn't beneficial to the greater public. This is an important, simply an example of what we're talking about. Here's a water user who thinks it's working for them, and yet the rest of the community is like, the heck it is. In fact, the water use harmed the public and the ecosystem health substantially, and this is how. There were extraordinary human rights violations. We had over 2,500 narco slaves in the Illinois Valley alone who were living in tents, they were living in greenhouses, they were living in forests, and they were underfed, and they were given no bathrooms. They were using ditches and streams, and it was horrendous. There's depleted groundwater as a result of these organized crime syndicates. There are dry stream beds. There's polluted water, mowed down riparian areas, mayhem on our rural highways. There was stressed out wildlife, rampant code violations, and our communities were living under the existential threat of organized crime syndicates. In the Illinois Valley, we are a really isolated region, and they came in and treated us like we were in some region that had warlords. It was just extraordinary. And we got a few pictures. This one compliments of the Illinois Valley Fire Department, where the organized crime syndicate thought, well, we'll just burn all our plastic. This is right next to a good friend's house. This is one of 6 cannabis grows by organized crime syndicates within, we're talking, 200-300 feet between them. And each one's like 5 to 10 acres. So they're just really close. And they circled his home. That dead bear is on the edge of the property of a very good friend of mine in Selma, Oregon. That bear would walk by 4:30 p.m. every single day and just go hang out and do all sorts of stuff. and they found it dead one afternoon. And the Oregon State Police said without a doubt it was poison. This is the region in the Illinois Valley called Holland Loop. It is a beautiful, beautiful farming area. And this is what it looks like. You probably see some specks here. Those are the specks. That is taking away the landscape and leaving just the individual greenhouses. There are 531 cannabis grows in a 6 by 9 mile region right there. It looks like a giant DEQ violation from the air. I flew in a fixed wing aircraft and gridded out the entire valley, 200 square miles, 24 miles by 8 miles. And I went and mapped over 1,000 cannabis grows to the 1-foot resolution, calculated all the water use, and this is just one section of it. This is what they look like up close. This was actually a campsite that had been raided by the Josephine County Sheriffs, and this is where over 130 narco slaves who were under intense pressure, this is where they were living. A Josephine County Sheriff went out and picked a bunch of drip tape out of the Illinois River. We appreciate that. We really appreciate that. This is what I refer to as a garbage grow. It's one of so many, one of hundreds, where there's just essentially like a bit of a landfill with this. We do not consider this Mother Earth medicine. This is another one. This is a 60,000-yard hole that was dug illegally. The state has still not come down on the people for this illegal mining. And they took 60,000 yards and put it into trucks, drove it a mile away, and dumped it onto a cannabis site so that they could take the top of the mountain. They couldn't like do what mountaintop removal does in Virginia. They actually just had to level out the top of the mountain, and they did. And you'll see some tiny little specks in the top left corner of that little hole there. Those are 10-yard piles. You can see how big this thing is. This is Sucker Creek, and this is a map compliments of both Google Earth and the United States Geological Survey. And Sucker Creek is one of the major tributaries to the East Fork of the Illinois River. And at the very beginning, on the far right of the screen, it starts out at 23.6 cubic feet per second. That's a lot of water. And by the time it travels 9 river miles, it is at 3.34. This was in 2021. That is a 200,000 gallon per day drop over 9 river miles. And there are various factors that go in. Sometimes rivers go down below and come back up. We know how Sucker Creek works, and almost all of that is extraction from the river. We pressed the case that water use by organized crime syndicates was not in the public interest by citing the beneficial use of water doctrine. Oregon responded, and it passed Senate Bill 326 in 2023, and Section 3 of that bill outlawed using a water right to irrigate unlicensed cannabis. Now, the asterisk is that it's always been illegal to irrigate crops without a water right. So it's not like, if you don't have a water right, you certainly can't be irrigating your cannabis. But the state, until 2023, was saying that it was not unlawful to irrigate a 100-acre organized crime syndicate cannabis grow with a water right, as long as you had a water right. And, they were basically saying that it was okay to use water in the commission of a crime that's state-sponsored in terms of these water rights. And they outlawed that. And that's kudos to the state of Oregon, and kudos to the legislators who did that. We hold, however, that a plant does not have to be heavily regulated, the way cannabis is, for instance, for its irrigation to harm the public health and the ecosystems. Repeat that. We hold that a plant does not have to be heavily regulated for its irrigation to harm the public health and ecosystems. Too many groundwater-dependent ecosystems, ESA species, domestic wells, and trees are harmed. Cities, which use only 9% of water, don't even know where their long-term water sources are going to come from, because in too many cases, forage crops have seniority. Think about that. The cities where people live and they don't even use hardly any water are second or third to a bunch of forage crops. Remember, 78% of all water diversions go to irrigation, 9% go to cities, 1% goes to domestic wells. We will never wring enough water from cities to conserve our way to a prosperous posterity. You cannot conserve anywhere near the amount of water that we need to by going to the cities. You know, you can't get the water when you go to the restaurant. You have to ask for it. You need to like replace your shower head. You know, you need to pull out your lawn and do xeriscape. That's probably not a bad idea, actually. But I will tell you that the majority of these conservation ideas that are imposed upon public supply, municipal water supply systems and their users, it's all marketing. It is almost exclusively not going to have an impact to the extent where irrigation is. And irrigation at 78% is going to have to give up water to the extent commensurate with the scope and scale of its use. When a perennial stream is dewatered every summer and fall, then that is the same as a permanent effect, and it's way below what natural variability would do. So if that stream is drying up every summer, then you might as well just say in perpetuity, it's being dried up during the summers. When an aquifer is drained below the root zones of trees, they die. When the water levels keep dropping, domestic wells fail. All along, groundwater-dependent ecosystems suffer as the water levels are dropping. How many shallow lakes, marshes, and wetlands have dried up that service the Pacific Flyway that is one of the most important bird migration pathways in the world? This is Lake Abair, which is east of Klamath, in April of 2021. It's a saltwater lake. It is I think maybe the only one that's saltwater. And you can see the salt on the shores there. That lake has water in it. However, 3 months later, Lake Abair in 2021, July 2021, 3 months later, it is dried up. That is not a result of evaporation. That is a result of over-appropriating the Shiwakan River that flows into Lake Abair. And they're using that water for irrigation and other uses that are agricultural in nature. And they simply had the water rights. And so they had seniority, and no one was going to tell them they can't use that water. And so they ended up drying up the lake. And this has been a perennial problem for Lake Abair. And it's been a problem with so many streams. And now it's becoming a problem with our aquifers. Since 2022, who among you has seen parts of trees turning their leaves the first week of August, 2 months early? You're driving down Highway 5, you're driving down Highway 199, you're driving up through various places to the coast, you're headed out to Klamath. Wherever you go, you see deciduous trees, and I'm talking deciduous trees that are turning their leaves the first week of August. I've even started seeing it at the end of July. The tips, the tops, the branches, the browning off as if they're burnt. Groundwater is dropping below the roots of parts of trees, and it is not recharging sufficiently during the winters. Early on, I mentioned that stair stepping down where the recharge is not enough. It's the result of drought, but it's more importantly also the result of pumping too much water out of the system and sending it abroad on the jet stream, and it is not coming back in the winters. We are over pumping our sources and it's not returning. And that is causing our bank, our groundwater reservoir, to lose water. And here's a picture where you see like a bunch of trees in the foreground, and it's like August 15th. This is when this picture was taken in 2022. And you'll see trees that are around it that are still green. Some trees are able to reach the water still, and some roots don't. Here's another close-up of trees that are browning off, and then the neighboring ones next to them are not browning off. Here's an example, just taken August 22nd. One tree is already losing its leaves. It's an oak. The one next to it is not. And so what's happening is that parts of the tree's roots can reach, and so part of that tree dies off, or the whole tree starts losing water. And then what is happening is you come back a year later, and now part of that tree is a snag. Water League has been videotaping large stretches of road, and we've been doing it in 2022, 2023, and 2024. And we're going back and comparing the footage to see, oh, that part of that tree was dying, and we come back 1 year and 2 years later, and now that part of the tree is dead. And we know that trees die, and we know that trees die in various ways, but they don't die the way they are today. So what kind of water policies have been prioritized in 2024? Well, there are a couple good ones, and we are very proud of the Water Resource Department and the Water Resources Commission for standing up and doing what they can do at the administrative managerial level. Some priorities have been excellent, such as the new administrative rules restricting over appropriation of groundwater and other rules that are addressing the over pumping of groundwater. I want to distinguish the two. Over appropriation is giving out too many water rights. And they've got new rules now that says, well, we're not going to be giving out hardly any water rights for groundwater anymore because we have over appropriated the water in every basin in Oregon. And 50, 70 years ago, they pretty much stopped giving away surface water rights because they had done that with all the streams. The over pumping is actual curtailment of water. And earlier I was mentioning almost never do they tell water right holders, you got to stop pumping or you got to turn the volume down. There are extreme cases in what are called critical groundwater areas that have to go through a contested case hearing with administrative law judges. And then after all that rigmarole, you can go to the Oregon's appellate courts and appeal the decision. The process could be 5 to 10 years before a single drop of water is curtailed. And yet there is a process when groundwater users are pumping themselves out of business and in some cases permanently destroying aquifers or groundwater reservoirs that they can be stopped. But it's just so little and it's just so late. But there is at least one failure, and it's an interesting failure that is so bad that actually now there is a law in the 2025 legislative session that's under review. The Water Resources Department, in all its wisdom, started targeting the smallest half-acre produce gardeners on exempt domestic wells. And they were using their staff they hired to crack down on water theft that was related to the cannabis industry. So in 2021, all hell was breaking loose, and Governor Brown and the legislators were like, we're going to expand the number of assistant water masters. We're going to get ahead of this, right? Well, now they've decided to go after our farmers market gardeners, the folks who want to do CSAs or put a little fruit stand out in front of their house. And the reason why is because in the great state of Oregon, 70 years ago, they made it illegal to use your domestic well to irrigate a garden that you sell tomatoes off of, or anything in that matter. You can use that domestic well to irrigate your half-acre lawn that produces nothing. You can use that to grow a half-acre garden as long as you eat the produce yourself and you don't try to sell it to anybody. So we know that it's not about the volume of water, it's strictly about the commerce. And we ask ourselves, well, how much water do these, half-acre, small little backyard gardeners use that go to the farmer's market? It's almost immeasurable. It's so small. I mean, lawns are far more prevalent than gardens in general. And then of the people who do have little backyard gardens, how many of them are industrious enough to show up at the farmer's market? It's really incredible. It perpetuates some of the worst stereotypes of poor management. And now, do you remember this chart from the beginning? This is the groundwater chart, not surface water, groundwater. And again, we're going to remind ourselves that 88%, that blue line, 88% of all the wells in Oregon are domestic, and they use 4% of the groundwater. And then, compared to only 7,000 wells, they use 82%. So when we talk about these little half-acre, quarter, three-quarter-acre gardeners in their backyards, and then going to the farmer's market, we're talking about an infinitesimal amount of use. And yet that is what our officials decided to go after in 2024. And thankfully, there is a proposal before the legislature coming up that will correct this. But we have to ask, why would they enforce a law for the first time in 70 years? Note, they never enforced this before until just now. If you can have a lawn or a garden, but not sell from that garden, is the volume or the commerce really the big issue? At the same time that the state outlawed victory gardens 70 years ago in 1955, it actually created a new permission of 5,000 gallons a day for any single industrial or commercial use, but it was not to include irrigation. So think about this. Before 1955, you could use your garden and sell at the farmer's market, victory gardens, it was all good. They outlawed it in 1955, but then permitted 5,000 gallons a day to do industrial and commercial. I'll point out that 5,000 gallons a day is enough to do a full acre garden. And even then you might end up creating a swamp. So you got to be careful. So it's like, what's going on here? It's like, it's a double standard. And we want to know, why send in the assistant water masters who are hired to go after cannabis and the organized crime syndicates after our farmers market gardeners? These are our farmers market gardeners. These are our friends. These are our community members. Why would you do this? Why would they do this? Is targeting small gardeners who wish to feed their neighbors in alignment with our values? Is that like, expressions of the beneficial use of water for the present and posterity? The water use is so small and it maintains local connections among small farm traditions that are critical to secure our future and to our communities. That's what that water does. And that's the water that they're trying to take away. One classic warning sign of serious problems ahead is when those who hold responsibility make some ludicrous misjudgments. There's this theory that I'm not really supportive of, but it's called the broken windows theory. Started out in New York City. And if you go after the people who are breaking all the windows and jumping the turnstiles in the subway, then you're going to find the people who are actually doing the big, murders and all the horrible things, right? Well, that theory, as problematic as it is, it actually ideologically works when considering, like, if you're making some really bad mistakes with small issues, then can we trust you with the big issues? That's a real legitimate question. The 2025 legislative session, originally back in May, was billed as a major reformation, modernization of the water code. Governor Kotek, a big 3 cheers to Governor Kotek. She wanted and has said she wants to modernize the water code because she sees these problems. And she had her staff pull together 4 esteemed water use attorneys who really understand the law, and they put their heads together. They looked at about a dozen previous reports and pulled together 6 important priorities and presented them back in May before the House and Senate committees. And there was a lot of good feeling about, yeah, we need to do this. We need to fix the problems. And since then, it's been a black hole and very little information has come out about what's going on. And there is a big question as to whether or not this is ever going to really happen. Excuses are being made. We don't have enough money. We can't afford to modernize our water code, which on its face is just what always happens. You just say you don't have the money for it. Sorry, we're not having Christmas this year. Fortunately, our elected officials do know that we need to secure the future, but politics as usual, the conventional wisdom is coming in and it's doing what it always does, and it undercuts common sense. We as the people must ensure that changes that benefit the entire public and the flora and the fauna in the present and the future will occur. That's what it means to engage the public in water stewardship. That's what it means to get involved, 4.2 million Oregonians to get involved in their management and governance of water. And we practiced for 150 years of letting just a few thousand people take control of everything, and it's been an abject failure. It hasn't worked. The experiment should be done and over, and we need to democratize water use and water quality and water policies in the state of Oregon. We ask, will officials reform the laws to ensure the beneficial use of water for posterity so that water use is both in the public interest of the present and the future? We want to know that question. Officials need to modernize not just the water code, but their political culture, their thinking, and how they value water. What needs to be fixed before anything else are the ideologies and the ideas that got us into this place. You know, as the famous saying goes, our best thinking got us where we are today. We need to change our thinking. Will the folks at the controls of the great water rush govern and manage water for the future eagerly as they do, seeking short-term economic value in the present? And the great water rush, we've heard of the gold rush, we've heard of the green rush. The great water rush is really what happened over the last 150 years as everybody rushed across the West and came out here, set up shop. 150 million people now live in the West, and every bit of it has been using water. And at some point, it's just going to break the system. And we're at a point in the 21st century where we're really starting to notice the problems. And somebody has to speak out. Traditionally, too few. There are many people for decades and many very important organizations and elected and appointed officials who have been speaking out. And we need to support them. They need our support. Currently, there is a bit of a walking back right now of the significance of that 2025 legislative session on the pretense that there's not enough money. So I mentioned that. That is what's happening right now. It's like, oh, well, maybe we thought too much about what we thought we could handle. We don't have enough money. And my point and our position is that changing minds and perspectives and the political culture is inexpensive. It doesn't cost money. What costs a lot of money is perpetuating the errors of the past century. We can change our minds for a dime. One of the most serious errors of all time is putting the present in seniority over the future. When we talk about water law, prior appropriation doctrine, and the concept of seniority, it's like, oh, I got my water right first, so the rest of you can go to hell. You know, I get to use the water, and whoever has seniority gets to use water. Well, we've done that to the future. The present moment that we are in has seniority over the future, and we are regulating it off. For all intents and purposes, the future is a junior water user, and we are regulating off our descendants. Correcting this horror costs nothing but political will. It does not cost money. The old saying that whiskey is for drinking and water is for fighting presumed a struggle in the present, that very present moment. But every fight over water has harmed the future far worse than any bar fight. We are far more in conflict with our future selves and our descendants, the flora, the fauna, and entire ecosystems. We are in conflict with the future much, much more than we are with ourselves in the present. And if we think that we're going at each other in the present and it's bad, then we are in denial of how awful it is with those in the future who have no voice. They are the silent majority. Their hands are tied behind their backs, and they can't stand here today and stand up for themselves. We have to do that. And the people who have been at the controls for too long have never sufficiently looked after the future. They have almost exclusively looked after the short-term present and the short-term moment and the ingratiation and self-aggrandizement that comes from a myopic worldview driven almost exclusively by economic interests. To resolve our conflict with the future, we must acknowledge that every beneficial use today has an impact on tomorrow, some worse than others. We must use water for its highest and best purposes to live today for tomorrow. We call on the beneficial use of water for posterity. This concludes our presentation. I want to thank you all for being here today, and do not hesitate to reach out. We have an open book, open email, open policy all the time. Our organization is called Water League. My name is Christopher Hall. I am the executive director. My email, and I check it 7 days a week, is chris@waterleague.org. My phone number is 541-415-8010. And you can reach us and mail to us in Cave Junction, Oregon at P.O. Box 1033, Cave Junction, Oregon 97523. Our organization, Water League, works throughout the state of Oregon, and we are now reaching out across the West and working with people to engage the public in water stewardship so we can correct the past and look towards the future in a way that is equitable for all and is something that we can all feel good about. Again, thank you very much, and it's been a pleasure to be here today.